Sally is very sweet to let me get a little taller. And it really is nice to be able to see everybody when I'm talking. Thank you. All right, so often we talk about the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, which were adopted as the Unitarians and the Universalists came together in the 60s, except for one which was added in the 80s, the last one, the interconnected web. These principles are the guide to our interactions and into our organizational processes. But there are also these other things that are called the 6 sources. Now, if you, please take the piece of paper home if you would like to use it, but it's also always in the front of the hymnal, so you can always refer back to it. These 6 sources were adopted in the 80s as saying out loud, this is where we come from, this is what we depend on. And we're going to look at 3 this time, and then when I come back in August, we'll look at another 3. The sources were originally 5. There were 5 sources, and in 1995, a 6th one was added. And this is because of the Congress, or the UN Conference on the Environment that was held in Sao Paulo in 92, 93, and in which indigenous peoples were not allowed to attend. It was all government and non-government organizations, and indigenous voices were not considered worth listening to at the time. So the indigenous peoples of the world gathered outside the conference and periodically sent information into the conference, which made a difference. But the upside of having that happen was, for the first time in human history, the indigenous peoples of the world began communicating. They hadn't been. And so that has been ongoing. And in 95, because it takes a couple of years for principles and things to be changed, it was adopted to add indigenous wisdom as part of the sources of the Unitarian tradition, which we rely on a lot in this one. So with that little bit of history, I want to talk about those first 3, which are rarely spoken of in some Unitarian congregations, and it's an honor to be able to talk about them here. The first one is really the keystone, or the cornerstone of my own Unitarianism, if you will, and this is the direct experience of that transcending mystery. You know, when we allow ourselves to experience that, we are bigger, we are more fully who we are. And it moves us, as it says, to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. Okay? Unitarian Universalists have a theology. Unitarian, and Sally's good at this one, Unitarian, it's all one, and Universalist, no one left out. Okay? On this side or the other of the veil. But to be a Unitarian is to recognize that we don't understand the nature of that oneness. All right? We call it a mystery for a reason. Different UUs might use different terms. You know, we might say God, or we might say goddess, or we might say higher power, or we might say any number of other words, right? But what we're looking at is there is an underlying creative power of development in the universe. There is a power that makes transformation possible in us and through us and as us. And this may simply be the power we call love, right? Or it might be, as some people have said, the God of many names whose mystery is beyond all our naming, which is very much in alignment with Taoist tradition. That which is the Tao cannot be named. And as we look at that, we can see a number of things. St. Augustine, you may recall, who was one of the founders of Christianity in the Roman Empire, said, if you can understand it, it's not God. Isn't that wonderful? Right. So, at the time that Unitarianism was beginning to come into the American awareness through William Ellery Channing, William Wordsworth was writing, and in Tintern Abbey, which is a marvelous connection with your music, he says, "This is a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky. And in the mind of man a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things." The transcendent mystery. That is the fundamental source on which our tradition is based. And there is another source that in some congregations becomes a little louder voice, and this is the words and deeds of prophetic people. One of the early definers of Unitarianism, James Luther Adams, liked to say, "The prophetic liberal church is the church in which all members share the common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, with the intention of making history in place of merely being pushed around by it." Wow. All right. So to foresee the consequences. I used to teach a class in colleges called Technology and Society. And my job, as I saw it, was to help people get that every action we take has an impact in the world. Every technology we use, every tool we use, every material we use, everything we do has an impact. And it was really interesting because when I had younger students, I had two groups of students. I had returning students who were always older than I was. And then for a few years I also had undergrads who were in their, that 17 to 20 range that undergrads are. The undergrads really had a hard time with this. They did not want to have to acknowledge that when they get in their car, they're having an impact on the world. Or when they run down to the store and buy fast food or whatever, they're having an impact that maybe they don't want to have to live with the consequences of. Right? The idea that we can go through life doing whatever we choose without having any consequences is a very immature idea, but unfortunately it has been the norm in US culture for a very long time. So in that class we would have a 15-week semester, and along about the 10th, 11th, maybe 12th week, people would hate me. They really didn't like me. How dare I suggest that they think and do things differently? It was very hard for them. But usually about the 13th, 14th week, a week or two before finals, there would be a light that would go on and they'd go, "Oh my goodness, I have choice. I am at cause in my life. I can be responsible and accountable for the world I live in." And it would be, "Oh wow, hey, I'm really glad I took this class." The whole concept of human consequences has been what all of the prophets have been about. Whether we're looking at the Hebrew tradition in our Old Testament of Christian tradition, or whether we're looking at modern people like Martin Luther King Jr., they are people who are saying, this is what is happening and these are the consequences. Do you want to go there? Now, some of you know that I am, when I'm not wearing the minister's hat, I'm wearing my futurist hat. And a large part of what I do is that kind of prophetic work. I don't prophesy what is going to happen. I say, this is where we are, and these are the likely consequences of that. We might go this way, or this way, but it'll be in this range given what we're doing now. All right? So that is a form of being prophetic. But the next form is to realize that we get to act in alignment with what we see might be the highest and best good. And then to confront whatever the issues are in ourselves and in the world around us so that they can be transformed. That's our job as prophetic community. To be a prophet John Knox, one of the Reformation leaders, emphasized, requires living in and looking at the present, what is really going on around you. You know, we like to go through life with our eyes closed, but we really need to see what is happening. But that isn't always at the level of appearances, because one of the things that I've learned in my various degrees is that behind the appearances, behind what we're being taught or told is going on, something else deeper is happening. And behind that, something else even more deeply. So I want to give you a little bit of a response to what's being talked about in the news today and what, you know, is happening, what we were talking about when Fred was here. Thank you so much for being a prophetic voice in that way. What we are seeing is the reaction of an old, crumbling institution and order, unable to do anything new out of fear. And the second part of what's happening is we live in a culture that has condemned a lot of behaviors. And unfortunately, that which we resist persists. When we push against something, it has to push back. And we've been pushing against all these human rights issues in other countries for a lot of time. Several years, about 50, 60, now 70 years, we're at 75 years now, that we've been pushing against other countries doing things that we don't think is right. We must almost inevitably end up doing those things. It's sad, but that is how it happens. We cannot resist something and expect it to dissolve. We have to find ways around it. I heard in the 90s that Mother Teresa had said, I won't join your anti-war demonstration, but I will be happy to join a peace demonstration. And that's been my path all along. When all of my buddies were out there, you know, demonstrating against things, I was behind the scenes making the things I thought might replace those things that they were demonstrating against. So as you take on the mantle of being a prophetic being in a prophetic congregation, in a prophetic tradition, realize it is about what could be occurring in the direction of greater humanity, greater love, greater power of transformation that we want to put our energies. One of the things that Parker Palmer, some of you may be familiar with him, wonderful writer, initially was talking about teaching and then helped people get in touch with a deeper sense of being. He says, avoid the bad habit of domesticating the prophet of your choice, turning him into a cheerleader for your way of thinking and way of life. Remember that all the great prophets were courageous and outrageous folks who railed against the powers that be, challenged self-satisfied, excuse me, this is hard to say, self-satisfied posit, challenged self-satisfied posit, and threatened the prevailing social order. And the best way I know how to do that is to choose to live the way you know from your heart is the way to be in the world. Yes. Which brings us to the third source, wisdom. Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical, our acting life, and our spiritual life, our inner life. And one of the really important things about all liberal traditions, and especially Unitarian Universalists, is, as the website says, do not have to check, UUs do not have to check our personal background and beliefs at the door. Right? Whatever we're bringing to the table, whether it's out of an indigenous tradition or, you know, the Buddhist tradition or the Jewish tradition or the Catholic tradition or the born-again Christian tradition, you don't have to leave it behind. And if you are a humanist, you don't have to leave that behind, which is highly unusual on Sunday morning in what is often called church. Right? We honor the words and the lives of religious leaders from many, many different cultures because there is this wonderful core that is common across them that speaks to the heart and speaks to the soul and that helps us become more fully who we are. I used to work in redeveloping or rehabbing houses in the inner city, and we had this wonderful roofer. And this roofer turned out, he played the trumpet, and he had been a Baptist preacher. As he put it, well, the bottle got to me. So he is no longer a Baptist preacher. But while I knew him, he was attending 12-step meetings. And he said, you know, I love to listen to people describe their higher power because every time my God grows, my idea of who and what that transcendent mystery is grows because he's open, as we are, open to hearing how other people are experiencing that and moving with that. We draw upon both teachings and rituals from oral traditions. We don't leave them behind. So we will honor various holidays, as you heard. We're honoring the indigenous traditions of the equinoxes, solstices, and the cross days, the midpoints between them. And we honor some of the Jewish holidays, and I'd like to do a little more with that, and maybe Tuvi and I can make that happen. And we honor the Christian holidays. And when I can, I try to squeeze in Muslim holidays as well, so that we can get a better handle on what that faith is about, because it is salam, the people of peace. Mm. Yes. Yes. Salam, shalom, Salem. It all means peace. So we read the scriptures from these traditions, and we listen to the teachers of these traditions, and it really doesn't matter to us what that source is, where that comes from, because we're listening for those kernels of truth that touch our hearts and our souls. We interpret each one in the context of the time in which it was written, whether it be, from something that was written 4,000, 5,000 years ago, or something that was written 20 or 30 years ago, right? And we recognize the inspiring stories that fill all of the sacred traditions, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, or the New or the Old Testament, or whether it's, in some of the, Islamic tales, or wherever it is, or the Buddhist sutras. They're beautiful stories and inspiring, but we recognize no scripture is to be interpreted narrowly or oppressively. It's beautiful, it's inspirational, and it's wise. But in our tradition, scripture is never the only or final word. And that's really important to recognize. There is insight there is possibility there is opening there are pointers there we can use, but it's not the final word. For the same reason that we can't say who and what this transcendent mystery is. The scriptures can't do it either. So there's another piece of that also. Samuel Longfellow used to say, revelation is not sealed. Truth and right are still revealed. Yes. When we see and allow for that, then we realize that the ancient texts can't be the final word. Not only because they're speaking to a cultural time and place that isn't this one, but also because there is an opening in humanity. Humanity is developing, and what is emerging may be and require a new kind of revelation. So what I'm really saying here is that this is a living tradition. Each and every one of us are developing and becoming more fully who we are. And our organizations, whether they're fellowships or churches or the online community or whatever, are also becoming more fully who and what we can be as human communities in which we honor these sources and these principles. And I would like to quote from the Buddhist Sutras, if I may, in closing. Believe nothing merely because you have been told it. Do not believe what your teacher tells you merely out of respect for the teacher. But whatever, after due examination and analysis, you find to be kind, conducive to the good, the benefit, the welfare of all beings, that doctrine, believe and cling to, and take it as your guide. Thank you.